to do something else, and we've had quite a few other activities. But then together with some other leaders of the project, we decided to also add this line of online talks that we called Apply TV, after Apple TV, I guess. And one of the original movers of this initiative was exactly Fabio Palieri. So it's some kind of self-inflicted pain. He'll be the first presenter. But before I say just a few words about Fabio, again, I'll repeat what I said just a few minutes ago, that this meeting is recorded and it's live broadcast to YouTube. You all know that because you agreed when you were registering, but just so that you know, you can turn off your camera or in the worst case, even leave the meeting if you feel uncomfortable being in the public sphere. So welcome everybody again. We're really happy you can join us. These are the advantages of the very disadvantageous situation, being stuck at home for 1 year. And we're very much aware this must be 657 Zoom meetings we've been having in the last year. Nonetheless, we hope that it will bring some joy to your homes in these gloomy times. So our first speaker of the series, we're going to have 5 more speakers, and each of the sessions will be chaired by someone else, another member of the action, is Dr. Fabio Palieri, who is a researcher at the National Research Council in Rome, Italy. And many of you know him, but just 2 words of introduction. He was trained as a cognitive scientist. That's his background, and he's working in many areas related to this specific training. I'm very curious about his work on the capuchin monkeys, for example. But in this very context, many of you know him as a person very active in argumentation studies, and among other contributions to research, but also to organization, he's the chair, the first initiator and the chair of the European Conference on Argumentation. That will be organized also, I guess, next year in Rome. And he is also the leader of the Working Group 3 of the Cost Action, together with Serena Dilata and Margacus. So Fabio, I guess without further ado, I'll give you the floor. You have about half an hour for your presentation so that we finish 35 past. Thank you again, Fabio, for being able to speak at such a short notice, and well, nice presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcin. And as you said, this is mostly self-inflicted pain. I will try not to inflict too much pain on the audience. Let me share my screen now. And okay, you should be able to see it now. If not, please just holler and we will fix it. Okay, so welcome to this first episode of Apply TV, as we call it. What I'm going to talk about, well, the main topic is the role of science communication in the public debate surrounding the pandemic. But I guess the broader topic is the kind of huge responsibility that having a very powerful voice in public debate entails. That's the reason why you see Trump on my first slide. I'm not going to talk about Trump, but what happened in Washington recently is a powerful reminder of the fact that having a huge megaphone has very significant effects on reality, on what happens in our world. So there is really a huge responsibility. And this huge responsibility right now, I think, sits a lot with science experts, and in particular medical experts, in the context of the pandemic. And this is what we are going to talk about. So this is the menu for today, the plan for today. I will start setting the scene and give you some very quick notes on the newfound centrality of science in public debate regarding COVID and also its implications. And then I will really get down to specifics. I want to analyze the 2 very specific cases. The first one is a case of public disagreement between medical experts at the beginning of the pandemic in Italy and how it was, I think, mishandled. And the second one is actually more recent. That's, I think, November 2020. It's a statement made by another medical expert regarding COVID-19 vaccines and how it was misinterpreted as an expression of vaccine hesitancy. And finally, if there is time, I want to say something more general on this idea of COVID denialism, which has been circulating a lot in public debate And there are some legitimate use of that label, but I think most of the uses that are being observed right now are rhetorical abuses of this label, and this is problematic. And finally, we will wrap it up with some conclusion and take-home messages. So let me start from the obvious. I mean, COVID-19 is definitely the topic not only of the hour, but of the year. It will probably remain the main topic for the next year and possibly for years to come. And in the context of this unprecedented worldwide crisis, we started looking for answers, and we looked for answers to people like this guy here. Now, these are public figures. They were already public figures, but most of us were not familiar with them. Now they have become incredibly important spokespeople in public debate. I'm sure you are familiar with this person. This is Anthony Fauci. You're going to be familiar with him even if you're not from the US. And I think Dr. Fauci will go down in history as a very positive character in all this mess, because during the Trump administration, he was basically one of the very few voices of reason on how the US were handling the pandemic. But there are also more controversial figures in this kind of debate. This is Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. He is the Director General elect of the World Health Organization, so a very important figure, a very authoritative figure. I'm saying he is more controversial, mostly in relation to what China did. And to be clear, I'm not talking about any kind of crazy conspiracy theory about the virus being engineered in some lab in Wuhan. I'm talking about something much more serious, the idea that China was not very forthcoming, to say the least, in sharing information about the pandemic at the very beginning, and how the World Health Organization is being accused of not playing its role as an international watchdog in all of this. And the reason why Ghebreyesus is in the high of the storm in relation to that controversy is because his election was powerfully sponsored by China. So you see, there is a kind of an implicit accusation of a conflict of interest. Now, regardless of their standing, either positive, negative, or controversial, these are very important. These have become, all of a sudden, very important figures in public debate regarding the pandemic. These scientists were thrown into the spotlight of public debate basically overnight. And this happened against the background of our mainstream understanding of science. And when I talk about mainstream understanding, I'm not talking about the image of science that scientists or even scholars have. I'm talking about the perception of science by lay people and the kind of image of science which is basically being described and proposed every day in the general media. And this is the old-fashioned idea of science as an oracle. Society has a problem, and it has science to deliver a solution to that problem. Now, in that view of science, which is basically a misconception, there are three pillars. The first one is the idea that science is unanimous. I don't know about you, but when I read in the press about a statement like scientists say, scientists believe, according to scientists, I'm always puzzled. I mean, I wonder, what is this thing that all scientists unanimously believe? Because as a scientist, as a scholar, I know very well that full agreement in science is extremely rare. Many of you will be familiar with this notion of 97% consensus. This is actually the rough estimate of how many climate scientists believe that climate change is man-made. And this figure, 97, is used to indicate that there is actually an established fact. Man-made climate change is an established fact. Why? Because 97% of scientists believe in it. But there is still that 3%. And that's actually, I mean, 97% is as good as it gets in terms of unanimity in science. And this is normal. The second misconception is the idea that science delivers certain answers. I mean, that when you ask a question to science, the answer will be 100% sure. This is typically not the case. And finally, the third aspect, which is usually not considered, but is actually very important, is this idea that a scientist will deliver a verdict that has taken everything into account. Now, this picture of science is powerfully wrong. I mean, science is actually almost the opposite of all that. Science is a debate among dissenting voices, and this is a good thing. This is the way in which we make progress. It's based on trial and error. As a matter of fact, the experimental method is a way of systematizing trial and error, and this is not a bug, it's a feature of science. This is how it works. And also, I mean, if there is one thing that we know from the history of science is that there has been an increase in specialization, which means that scientists, as a rule, tend to be extremely single-minded. They need to be, because they need a highly technical know-how to do their job. So you cannot expect them to be kind of big picture guys. They are not. They are trained not to be. So the point is, this is a misconception, and this misconception is easily proven wrong. But when it is demonstrated to be wrong, this huge expectation that the public is having on science basically collapse, and this can actually backfire quite spectacularly. And what I'm saying is that all the examples we will be discussing today can be understood against the background of this misconception of science. Okay, now let's move to the specifics. First of all, please keep in mind the timeline here. We are talking about February 2020, the very beginning of the first wave of the pandemic. And we are in Italy, and Italy was being hit, and as you know very well, it was hit extremely hard by the first wave of the pandemic. At some point, we were in the worst shape in the whole world at that point. But this was still, these were still early days. We didn't know much about the pandemic. And this professor here is Maria Rita Gismondo. She's the director of the Department of Clinical Microbiology, Virology, and Bioemergence Diagnostics in an important hospital in Milan. And at that point in time, she was really in the trenches in the fight against the virus, because her lab was in charge of analyzing all the samples from the north of Italy. So she was working a lot on that. And this is a post. It is something she posted on Facebook in February. She was basically talking about, this is in Italian, I will translate the important bit in a second. She was basically describing how overworked they were at that point. But the crucial passage is the following. She wrote, "It seems crazy to me. We have mistaken an infection slightly worse than a flu for a lethal pandemic. That's not the case. Look at the numbers." Okay. Now, of course, now we know she was wrong. But at that point in time, that issue was still on the table. It wasn't clear whether or not it was much more than a regular flu. But of course, this statement, this very public statement from such an authoritative figure, was immediately disputed by other medical experts. This is Roberto Burioni, who is a professor of microbiology and virology at another university in Milan. And he also a bit of a social media star. He communicates a lot, usually, already before the virus, even more now. And he was definitely not in agreement with Gismondo. This is what he wrote. "What a gigantic nonsense. It is much more than a flu. It is much worse than a flu, since 20% of cases requires intensive medical care and hospitalization, while for the flu, the serious cases are just a tiny percentage of that. Don't panic, but don't lie either." That was the message by Burioni. I mean, so far, so good. This is just honest and genuine disagreement between experts. But things got ugly on social media, as it is often the case. And this is on Twitter, where Roberto Burioni is extremely active. At some point, someone was asking him, "Look, Gismondo is saying A, you're saying not A, who should we believe?" And of course, Burioni replied, "You should believe to me." But he also added, "I fear the lady of the Sacco," that would be Gismondo, "has worked too much lately. She should take a rest." Now, this is a very sexist, very dismissive statement. I mean, in English, the word lady, I guess, has also kind of a positive connotation, but the Italian word signora, if it is used to describe someone who is a medical professional, it's definitely dismissive. I mean, what he was saying was, look, this is just a poor woman, overtired, you shouldn't pay any attention to her at all. And in fact, Burioni was challenged by other users on Twitter about this. I mean, someone here said, "Come on, I mean, the lady of the Sacco, seriously? This is not acceptable," okay? To that, Burioni replied by doubling down on the irony. He said, "Look, lady actually replaces another word I was about to type," meaning that he meant to insult her even more explicitly. So, of course, this kind of behavior by Burioni generated the usual shitstorm, a lot of media buzz, and in the end, apparently, there was kind of a happy ending. He issued a very public apology. This is an excerpt. "I made a mistake." This is Burioni speaking. "I should not have reacted by referring to her in that way, lady of the Sacco. In fact, I should not have replied to her publicly. I should have contacted her privately." By the way, this is very good advice in general on social media. "But I didn't. I just sent her now a message to apologize. She used the wrong number. I used the wrong word. But these are crazy days. We are all under a lot of pressure." So basically, they made up in a sense. Just full disclosure, a few days later, this book was published in Italy, and it was a huge success. So possibly Burioni was also after some free publicity, but that's not the point. The point is that if you forget about the polarized debate and you look at what they were saying, there was actually valuable information on both sides of this debate. And again, let me stress, these were the early days of the pandemic, and we were really very ignorant about the basic facts of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. We needed more information. And for instance, Gismondo was pointing out a couple of things that are actually correct. First of all, unless there is some prior vulnerability, individuals should not fear death because of the contagion. Because, I mean, in general, if you're healthy and if you're in a certain age range, that's not what you should fear, at least not more than you fear it for other kind of illnesses. And also, she was pointing out the fact that they were receiving too many samples. In Italy, at some point, we were actually testing too many samples, which clogged the labs and prevented them from working as fast as it was needed. So there was actually some legitimate concern on her part. And on the side of Burioni, of course, he was basically right on many facts. It is much worse than a flu. It has a higher mortality rate, a higher contagion rate. Even more importantly, it has a much higher severity rate, as we know very well right now. So there is a danger of overwhelming the medical system. And also, there was a need at that point in time for extreme prevention measures to contain contagion. And at that point, there was still a lot of debate in Italy: should we actually do something about it, or it will just go away? So you see, there was valuable insight on both sides of this debate. The problem is that all of this was canceled by the polarized debate. As soon as he called her the lady of the Sacco, all the relevant information went out of the window and people started bickering about, oh, he should have said that, she should have reacted differently, and so on and so forth. The debate became full of personal attacks one way or the other, and all the valuable information was lost. This is bad. This is not how scientific disagreement should be handled in the public eye. Okay, that's the main point. Let's move to the second case, which is very different. But again, we have another highly authoritative source. This is again from Italy. Sorry, I'm kind of deeply embedded in my country when it comes to this specific problem. But this is Andrea Crisanti. He's a professor of molecular parasitology and clinical microbiology. He has a very high H index, if you believe in this thing, 62. But even more importantly, he was the leading author of a groundbreaking study on the role of the asymptomatic carrier in the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the very few first studies on that, because she actually studied the population of Uganeo, which is a small town in Italy, which was badly affected by the virus during the first wave. This was a very important, a seminal, a pivotal study. It was published in Nature. So, I mean, this is the kind of person that you want to believe in when you are looking for information and advice on the pandemic. Now, what happened? Well, there was this TV interview in November 2020, just a couple of months ago. And this was a scientific program, by the way. This was not some kind of stupid talk show. This was a legitimate scientific broadcast. And the journalist asked Crisanti, would you take the first vaccine available in January? To which he replied, without data, I would not. And the journalist asked, why not? Well, because I want to be assured that it is a well-tested vaccine compliant with all the criteria for safety and efficacy. I believe I have the right as a citizen, and I'm not willing to accept shortcuts. This is interesting because, of course, he is saying something very reasonable. We do not want to take a vaccine if all the safeguards are not in place. But the way in which this played out in the media, both the traditional media and social media, was, I mean, of course, easily predictable. Medical experts says we should not trust the COVID-19 vaccines. It was taken as an indication from a highly respected medical expert of vaccine hesitancy. This was incredibly bad for the whole vaccination campaign in Italy, okay? And of course, he explained himself later on. He tried to say, no, I didn't mean that, blah, 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 but the misunderstanding was there. And the misunderstanding, this is the relevant point for argumentation scholars like us, was a legitimate one. Let's see why. There is a lot to unpack here. Okay, so the basic message was a conditional here, okay? If I do not have the data, I, Andrea Crisanti, will not take the vaccine. That was what he said. Now, with conditional, there is such a thing as conditional perfection, which is the tendency to actually interpret a conditional, something which is stated as a conditional, as a biconditional. In the case of a negative conditional, a condition in a negative context like this one, this means strengthening a necessary condition having the data is presented as a necessary condition for taking the vaccine to a sufficient and necessary condition. So what Crisanti later explained was, look, what I meant was, if I have the data, I will of course take the vaccine. If I do not have the data, I would not take the vaccine. So he actually meant his conditional to be perfected by the interpreter. The problem is that under negation, conditional perfection works very well with threats. If you say to your kids something like, if you don't do your homework, I will not let you watch TV, then they have a legitimate expectation that if they do their homework, they will be allowed to watch the TV. If they tell them, you know what, I didn't really say that, they can protest, and they would be right to do so, because there is a very clear and strong pragmatic implication that what you actually meant was biconditional. However, there was no reason to interpret Crisanti's statement as either a promise or a threat. I mean, in fact, it could be easily interpreted as an objective statement. And if you interpret it as an objective statement and you think about it, actually, having the data is not a sufficient condition to take a vaccine. Because what you need is not only having the data about safety and efficacy and blah, 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 you also need a reason to take the vaccine, which of course in context, there was a reason to take the vaccine, but it was not included in what is said. So there was actually good reason to block the interpretation in terms of conditional perfection here. But it's much more problematic than that, because there was also clearly a missed opportunity for clarity. I mean, if the point was to stress the need for transparent and complete information on the vaccines, while at the same time affirming the fact that vaccination was something to be desired and to be actually undertaken, there were better ways of expressing the concept. For instance, as soon as convincing data on safety and efficacy will be disclosed, I will take the vaccine. This is basically conveying the same kind of information, but at the same time is also clearly stressing that taking the vaccine is the right thing to do. So the question at that point in time was, why did he prefer an ambiguous formulation over much clearer formulations that were available? Also, the kind of communicative strategy that he adopted here gave a lot of prominence to a highly inflammatory statement, which is this idea that there won't be the data will not be available when the vaccines are released. And this is just weird. I mean, if you put it as the antecedent of this condition, as he did, without data was literally the first words that he uttered. If you do that, you're giving prominence to this suggestion that maybe the data will not be available. And why should you do that? I mean, at that point, we were in November, there was an argument to be made about the fact that some people were overly optimistic about the availability of vaccines, because we didn't yet have the data at that point. We have some preliminary results. They were really encouraging, but we didn't have the actual trials. But this is a completely different argument from suggesting that when we made the general population, the data will still be missing or somehow deficient. So why suggesting that lack of data could be an issue in the first place? And finally, when he tried to explain himself, I mean, when the journalists asked, why would you hesitate to take the vaccine? He said the following: we have the right to know that vaccines are well tested and compliant with all the criteria for safety and efficacy, so shortcuts should not be tolerated. Now, this is really a fine sentiment, but it's completely obvious. It's actually encoded in thousands of regulations about vaccines. I mean, there are, for instance, in Italy, vaccines have to be approved not only by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, but also by our own national agency. And both these bodies will precisely make sure that criteria for safety and efficacy are respected, and then no shortcuts will be tolerated. And again, the problem is Crisanti is not just a lay person. He is someone in the known of these things. He's a medical expert. Why should someone in the known suggest that this might actually not be the case? His statement was basically feeding a conspiracy theories here, because he was suggesting that someone that is in a position to know that everything is in order is actually suspicious about the fact that something is amiss. So that was really terrible. This is, in my view, this is as bad as it gets in terms of public communication of science. Okay. Let's move to the final item on our list, and let me see how I'm doing with, okay, wow, I might actually put it off. Okay, COVID-19 denialism. You know, there is this category, and it's been floating around a lot in the debate. And let me just, for the record, say very clearly, there is such a thing as COVID-19 denialism. Okay, it's not a myth, it exists. And this is an example. Okay, someone waving this kind of sign in a crowd, well, that person is exhibiting what I would call COVID-19 denialism. The tests are rigged, the death count is false, masks are useless. Okay, this is straight up denialism. But we have to keep in mind that this whole idea, this whole label of COVID-19 denialism is modeled after the idea of Holocaust denialism. Okay, which means, this is guilt by association. I mean, being a denialist is a very, very, very bad thing. This is not the kind of accusation that you should throw around lightly. Okay, it's a bad thing. To call someone a COVID-19 denialist is definitely something extremely offensive. Nevertheless, there is some reality. There is some legitimate use of this label. This is an example. This is another one. I apologize to all my US friends if there is anyone in the audience. Many of the examples are actually from the US, but it's not just a US thing. I mean, we have the COVID-19 denialists also in Europe and in other countries. But this is another example. This is a rhetoric of courage in relation with COVID-19. Shake my hand, I'm not afraid. Fear is the real virus. This is what's on the signs, and these are people basically vaunting all kind of regulation regarding COVID. They're not wearing masks and so on and so forth. And it's not just something that you see in random crowds. This is, for instance, Fox News basically promoting a rhetoric of COVID-19 denialism. Okay, they are talking about coronavirus hysteria. They are saying that media uses virus coverage as a political weapon. Well, they were basically supporting Trump narrative at that point. Okay, so all of these are legitimate and bona fide cases of COVID-19 denialism. However, there are many other things that some people are tempted to call COVID-19 denialism, which are not. And in those cases, we should use extreme caution. Let me give just a bunch of examples. Okay, so this is the UNICEF, but basically anyone with an interest in education, if you ask them about the impact of the pandemic on education, they will talk about the huge learning loss produced by containment measures against COVID-19. They are not saying that we should not undertake those measures. They are saying that there is a huge cost to be paid. They are pointing out that this cost is being paid mostly by the younger generations. And they are also pointing out, this has been hammered over and over by any kind of educational studies on the effects of the pandemic on education, that the learning loss affects disproportionately different categories of those. So inequalities are actually being reinforced by our handling of the virus. This is not COVID-19 denialism. This is pointing out a very important problem, the need to balance conflicting rights and how to manage generational fairness in dealing with the virus. Here is another false example of COVID-19 denialism. This is Richard Horton, which happens to be the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, one of the most authoritative medical journals in the world. Definitely not the COVID denier, but look at the title of this comment he recently published. COVID-19 is not a pandemic. Now, if you read the article, you will find out that what he meant to say is that COVID-19 is actually a syndemic. A syndemic is a technical concept to say that it's not just a matter of the contagion, it's also a matter of how the contagion affects different groups of people, which is a very interesting concept. But you should not take that as an indication of having a relaxed attitude towards the virus. That's not the point at all. The point on the table is that inequality is the consequence of the virus, and inequalities which are implicit in the treatments of the pandemic should be taken into account in public debate. Okay, this is another example. This is a kind of a, well, partially controversial journalist from the UK, Rod Liddell. And he recently wrote this op-ed in the Sunday Times. COVID is rapidly killing off your freedom to dissent, so I suppose I'll do what I'm told. Now, if you want, you can read the article online. The point is not what is exactly his position. The point is that this concern, the silencing of legitimate dissent in the face of the pandemic, is a legitimate concern. It's something we need to take into account in our discussion. And of course, on the same topic, this is an even more authoritative source. This is Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And that's her on emergency powers related to the virus. Emergency powers should not be a weapon governments can wield to quash dissent, control the population, and even perpetuate their time in power. They should be used to cope effectively with the pandemic, nothing more, nothing less. This is not COVID-19 denialism, and it's not trivial at all, because this is a problem not only in less than democratic regimes, so to speak, but even in good old-fashioned democracies. For instance, in Italy, legislation has been passed over the last years, bypassing all the regular norms for legislating in our country, and all the usual checks and balance are no longer in place. This is understandable in the face of the pandemic, but it needs to be taken into account, and we need to include this in public debate. Now, you may think, okay, all of these are clearly not cases of COVID-19 denial. So what are you talking about? Okay, let's look now at the borderline cases, okay? Many of you will be familiar with this. This is the Great Barrington Declaration. This is a document that has been signed by three, well, very well-respected medical experts: Martin Kulldorff, Harvard, Sunepra Gupta in Oxford, and Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, three leading institutions. The red numbers at the bottom of this slide are their H index, again, very good scientists. And basically, this declaration is a declaration in which they, of course, they acknowledge the existence and the severity of the pandemic, but they are proposing an alternative, different approach to its treatment. They are basically saying what they call focused protection. We should protect only the vulnerable categories. Everybody else should be free to do whatever they usually do, because in this way we'll reach herd immunity, and that will be a more effective way of containing the virus. Now, this declaration was, well, basically the UK government based their first response to the pandemic on these ideas, and we know that it failed. The US administration, I mean, honestly, I don't think Trump had any strategy regarding COVID, but he said that this declaration was basically supporting what they were doing or not doing regarding the virus. And also Sweden was somehow inspired by this. Now, the point is, the World Health Organization has stated very publicly that this is not a sound strategy. It's unethical. It's not based on scientific facts, and so on and so forth. Many other medical experts disavow this kind of strategy. Still, the general point, which is let's remain open and consider the viability of alternative strategies, is something that we cannot simply dismiss. We need to have a discussion about that. And then we can conclude that certain strategies are not productive. But the topic cannot be silenced. And here is another fairly extreme case. This is really borderline. This is Giorgio Agamben. This is an Italian philosopher, but it's kind of a very prominent philosopher in Europe in general. He's a continental philosopher, which is why many of the people in the analytic tradition possibly don't know him, but he's a very famous philosopher in his own circles. And he was very vocal since the very beginning in denouncing what he called the sanitary dictatorship in Italy. And now this is an interesting case because many of his factual statements, I think, would classify as COVID-19 denialism. He was saying things like, well, no, the mortality rate is very low. It's not very serious. It's basically like a flu, and so on and so forth, which turned out to be pretty incorrect in insight. However, the central topic of his message was the fact that we were being ruled by fear in our response to the pandemic, and not only in our response to pandemic, but in politics in general. And this topic, the role of fear in the exercise of power, especially in time of crisis like the current one, is a relevant topic. And is something, again, to be considered, because there is an element of truth in that, not in his facts, but in the kind of problem he was pointing out. Okay, so the reason why we need to tread carefully with this notion of COVID-19 denialism is because when all these ideas filter down to the public debate, to the real public debate, to the social arena, let's say social media, well, things really become ugly. I mean, there has been several instances of what I call pandemic name calling. I'm sure you are familiar with this label of Covidiot. This is a neologism. These are some kind of joking definition of the term. Someone who refuses to wear a mask or practice safe social distancing, especially now that we are a year into this mess, or even more, well, extreme, a stupid person who stubbornly ignores social distancing protocol, thus helping further spread COVID-19. Here's an example. Are you seriously going to visit grandma? Dude, don't be such a Covidiot. Or, this is really specific, a stupid person who hoards groceries, needlessly spreading COVID-19 fears and depriving others of vital supplies. See that guy with the 200 toilet paper rolls? What a Covidiot, okay? Now, I get it, it's kind of funny, but the problem is that it's funny only if you're not the one being called a Covidiot. And we cannot start using this label for everybody. Here's another example. What I call aggressive peer policing. I mean, I don't know whether you like to jog, but here in Italy, if you were a jogger last spring, you were in big trouble, because even if it was allowed by law to go out jogging, given that, assuming you respected some safeguards, people started really hating joggers and basically pointing out that joggers were spreading the virus and were responsible of all bad things. They were selfish people and so on and so forth. This was extremely aggressive. And in fact, in Italy, we invented this label of window sheriffs. At that point in time, people were forced to stay at home by the lockdown, and they started basically passing their time at the window to police what other people were doing, most of the time without much reason to do so. Why this
Fabio,
is a problem?
Fabio,
Yeah,
can
go
you
ahead,
wrap it up in about 4 minutes?
Martin. After this, we move to the conclusion. So we should be able to. Thank you, Martin. Okay, why this is a problem? Why should we be careful in doing what I call the nihilism bashing? Well, because we have to keep in mind the goal. The goal is to broaden the discussion, not to make it more narrow. We want to stimulate open-ended, civil, possibly civil, public debate on the many complex issues that surround the pandemic. That's our goal. In contrast, if we get into the habit of just accusing people of being COVID deniers, what we are actually doing is promoting polarization, silencing dissent, and blocking critical engagement with potentially fruitful ideas. Because some of these ideas will be just crackpots, and those should be refuted, but others might actually have some merits. So what I'm saying is that accusing people of COVID denialism is a strategic mistake, and this remains true, and that's important, sometimes, even when you're right. Okay, even when, as a matter of fact, we are kind of justified epistemically to pass the judgment on the other person. Okay, let's wrap it up as Martin asked. Obviously, the newfound centrality of scientific expert in public debate is a very good thing, potentially, but it entails huge responsibility. Okay, really huge, unprecedented responsibility. These people are not used to that kind of spotlight. And here is an example. We know that the misinformation and conspiracy theories are bad enough when they're being spread by, well, lay people or people like us, but they become really devastating when the source is a very authoritative source. This is a famous case. This is the 2008 Nobel Prize in Medicine, Luc Montagnier. The Nobel Prize in Medicine. If you cannot believe the Nobel Prize in Medicine, who should you believe? And yet these people, Professor Montagnier, started propagating crazy idea, basically conspiracy theory about the virus, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus being engineered in some shady lab in Wuhan. And these were disproved. This was in a preprint that was not peer-reviewed. The whole scientific community basically destroyed the paper. There was no serious foundation behind this allegation, yet these allegations were made. And you can imagine the impact of such allegations being made by a Nobel Prize. And again, disagreement, we already mentioned that disagreement is the engine of scientific progress, but it needs to be managed in terms of public communication. Disagreement is okay to talk about scientific disagreement in public, but we need to do it in the proper way. So I guess the real take-home message is don't improvise, okay? We desperately need medical experts in the current situation, but we also need communication experts, because most of the medical experts are not trained, are not competent in communicating their message. And this has enormous consequences, as I try to show with our very short and very sparse case studies. So just to conclude, this is our mission, guys, okay? There's a lot of work for the network, because the communication experts I was evoking, it's actually us and other people like us. So we should really try to find our voice in all of this, because that voice is very much needed. Thank you very much, and sorry for being long.
Oh, thank you very much, Fabio. So I guess we can all use our clapping function here. And thank you so much. So
no, please.